Hey everybody, how's it going? Welcome back to another episode of Podio Commentary. My name is Matt Jarbo, and today we're going to be talking about the 1973 and 1974, The Three Musketeers, and its part 2/sequel/follow-up, The Four Musketeers, which were shot at the same time as a massive production, but were ultimately split into two movies, much to the chagrin of the cast, who thought that they were only making one movie. This movie is an adaptation of the Alexandre Dumas, the Three Musketeers novel, not tying in, of course, to the two sequel novels. That, of course, comes in later on with the 1989 Return of the Musketeers, which is another film that I also watched. And these movies and that movie were actually sponsored by big-time supporter of the channel, H-Barts. He's a huge fan of these older films. He knows I like The Three Musketeers from 1993. I'm a big 1993 Stephen Herrick, Disney's Three Musketeers fan. Okay, give me Bryan Adams all day, every day. And he sponsored me to watch them. And so after a few months of trying to be able to actually sit down and watch these things, I did. I was able to carve out the about probably 5 hours in total to watch all three movies. And I've got a lot of thoughts. And I'll just say this. If you happen to enjoy, big swashbuckling epics from the 1970s with, at that time, AAA talent, you might like this. But if you're going to go into it thinking you're going to get something that's a straightforward action adventure epic full of political intrigue and backstabbing and musketeering, you're not. This movie, it falls a little short on that one, and I think there's reasons for that, as I'll get to. But when I say that this movie has a stat cast, I'm talking about Michael York as D'Artagnan, Oliver Reed as Athos, Frank Finlay as Porthos, Richard Chamberlain as Aramis. You've got Charlton Heston as Cardinal Richelieu, Christopher Lee as Count de Rochefort, Faye Dunaway as Milady de Winter, Simon Ward as Duke of Buckingham, Raquel Welch as Constance, and a lot of other people. Roy Kinnear as Planchette, he'll be talked about later on, and a lot of other people. This is a big cast. It was a movie that they shot over 17 weeks in Spain, and it's got a bit of an interesting production history. Now, the movie was directed by Richard Lester. And if you don't know who Richard Lester is, he is a bit of an iconic kind of comedy director, right? He directed The Beatles in A Hard Day's Night. He directed the sex comedy The Knack and How to Get It, which apparently was one of the very first sex comedies ever made. He also did Help with the Beatles, and that was a spoof of a James Bond spy thriller. And then he also did A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum in 1966, which was a big Hollywood movie. So this guy has been around for a while. He's still alive. He's in his 80s at this particular point, and he retired directing after doing Return of the Musketeers, and we'll talk about that later on. But when he was brought in to do this movie, the main reason why he was brought in is because the producers of the film, this is Alexander and Ilya Salkind, they had at one point in time actually considered the Beatles, John, Paul, Ringo, George, as the Three and Four Musketeers. I don't know which one would play D'Artagnan. If I had to guess, it would probably be Peter, right? I know that you might think that it might be Paul or John, but one of them would have to play Athos, and one of them would have to play probably Aramis, right? I could see Ringo as Portho. You could just kind of see it as Portho at that point. I mean, if you really think about it, he's totally a Portho type character. I never meant to drink all the wine sort of thing. God, that was terrible, Ringo. I apologize. Anyway, it was, during this whole process, when the Salkinds wanted to bring in the Beatles to play these characters, they had also brought in Richard Lester into this idea. And then eventually the Beatles kind of fell apart, right? Kind of like, remember how the Beatles were also going to do a live action Lord of the Rings? That would have been a thing as well. But Richard Lester ended up staying. And according to him, he says that he'd never actually heard of the Salkinds before this. They gave him 200 pages of this massive script. He read it, got excited, and said yes. And it was actually his first feature film in 5 years. But he had done like other commercials and he had tried to find financing for other projects, but none of that really kind of materialized. Lester did go on to say that the producers wanted it to be a sexy film and they wanted it to be with big stars such as Leonard Whiting and Ursula Andress. And he says that I just couldn't say no to anything in those early stages. And that was and he said he just couldn't say no to anything in those early stages. Now, initially, the movie was going to be a 4-hour film, except the problem is that they ultimately turned it into 2 movies, but no one told the actors. And that's really true, actually. That's a real big issue with this particular movie. So this movie was ultimately supposed to be like a massive 3-hour epic that had an intermission, because they had those back in the time, right? Not nowadays where they try to get in as many screenings as humanly possible. Even if a movie is 3.5 hours long, there's no bathroom break. You guys better just hold it. However, they couldn't do that. And so during production, it was determined that the film couldn't make the announced release date in that form. So they decided to split the longer film into 2 shorter features, which then, of course, turned into the Four Musketeers. Now, apparently, some of the actors knew about this decision. And by the time of the Paris premiere, and by the time of the Paris premiere, all of them had been informed, but they were not really happy about it, right? They really weren't happy about it at all. And I get that, because in their minds, these actors are thinking that it's 2 films for the price of 1, right? And they were only paid for 1 movie, and their contracts never said anything about a second feature. And this actually resulted in them filing lawsuits to get compensation for the salaries that would have been associated with making a second movie. Now, ultimately, that led to the Screen Actors Guild requiring all future actors' contracts to include what has become known as the Salkind Clause, which stipulates that single productions cannot be split into film installments without prior contractual agreement. And that's actually a really, really, really good thing. That is a very, very, very good thing for them to do, right? So at some point in time, these things are going to eventually have their day in the sun. It's really funny, though, that it was this British production that ultimately ended up, screwing over its cast that got that particular rule put in place. Now, as I said, they did shoot this thing over the course of 17 weeks in Spain. Initially, they wanted to film it in Hungary, but after they went to the country to go kind of do some location scouting, Richard Lester was like, no, I don't know how I feel about this. He didn't really find it feasible, mostly in part to the government restrictions on filming, right? And the last thing you really want in situations like this is to have the government kind of getting in your business, especially if you're going to have this massive a cast, this big of a budget, this long of a shoot. 17 weeks is over 4 months, which is quite some time to film this amount of stuff. And the thing is, though, when you watch the movie, you can kind of see where they were maybe, I don't know, I want to say kind of cutting some corners in regards to way that they shot it and the way that they edited it together in order to kind of make it longer. Because you got to remember, this movie was designed to be a 3-hour epic with a intermission. Okay. Now the movie, I think part 1 and part 2, so the Three Musketeers and the Four Musketeers, are somewhere in the neighborhood of about 1 hour, 45 minutes each. So that is 3.5 hours, which is a half hour longer than what they initially wanted. Now, granted, I'm being a little bit, speculative with the length of time here, but there's a lot in this movie that ends up really kind of, in both of these films, that largely end up being there as nothing more than ways to kind of pad out the screen time. There are moments in this movie of unnecessary silliness that get in the way of the political intrigue, right? As I'm watching this movie, it's almost like there are 2 different directors and they're kind of cobbling it all together. And Lester actually said that the Salkinds left him alone creatively for most of the filming, really with the exception of casting Raquel Welch and Simon Ward, because Raquel at the time was very big in all of the small countries. And it's true. Raquel Welch is a very popular actress with a very, distinct look. And the whole time she's playing Constance. Okay, oh, man. I don't want to like go negative on the movie because I don't like to do that. But I gotta say, Constance as a character is one of the worst characters I've ever seen in a movie. And Michael York's D'Artagnan was one of the worst actors I've ever seen in a movie like this because he's not a good guy. And I don't know if that was the point because I know we're meant to root for him. In fact, the entirety of like the Return of the Musketeers kind of hinges on what happens at the end of the Four Musketeers. And yet there's like still this like whole thing about Constance. Okay, so like first let me talk a bit about Michael York and D'Artagnan as we kind of meet them in the movie. Okay, we'll dive into the movie now. Because this is where, again, the movie kind of goes into this like vaudevillian aspect of it. And I feel like that was just Richard Lester's choice because he had done these comedies. And this was his first, at least as far as I can tell, his first time kind of doing a movie like this, a big swashbuckling epic. And he's got to like kind of add his signature to it. And he wants it to be physical, which it is very physical, but he wants it to be comedic because it worked for the Beatles. I mean, A Hard Day's Night is a very funny movie. It's very vaudevillian. And the thing is, though, is that kind of over-the-top, silly slapstick humor that would have played and killed and slayed back in the 1930s doesn't necessarily have its place in a 1970s swashbuckler, especially one that's an adaptation of a beloved book that is very political and that is very much meant to be kind of like a serious endeavor. And so when we first meet Michael York as D'Artagnan, he is fighting his father. He's learning swordsmanship from his dad. His dad teaches him the special move and then sends him on his way. And he's like, all right there, boy, go out there, join the Musketeers. I want you to fight all the time. All the time I want you to fight. And then, of course, as soon as he goes into the next town, he ends up making a number of like clumsy faux pas, which is just like par for the course for this entire freaking movie, with some of these characters. And he ends up getting insulted and knocked out and robbed by Rochefort, played by Christopher Lee, who, by the way, looks like an excellent version of Captain Hook in this movie. And he does a great job. And Rochefort is, of course, an agent of Cardinal Richelieu. And that, of course, is, Charlton Heston, and he's the big bad of the movie. And so when D'Artagnan kind of clumsily makes his way into the Musketeers headquarters, again, this is where it was a little bit different from the 1993 movie to this film. Was I was expecting the Musketeers to have been disbanded as they were in the 93 movie. They weren't. They were just a bunch of drunkards who were all like messing around as he's making his way through. And then he gets there and the guy's like, hey man, I don't got a job for you. I'm sorry. Like go and make a name for yourself and then come back. And then maybe you can be in the King's Guard. And it was here that he ends up, pissing off Athos, Porthos, and Aramis, each of them challenging him to a duel, which is that is a good scene. And then when he goes and he fights with them, they end up joining forces to fight back against the Cardinal's men, who just kind of like happened to show up and happened to think that they were doing something illegal. And then after kicking their butt and taking their money, D'Artagnan ends up going and meeting Planchette, who becomes his personal manservant, who is in the book and is played by Roy Kinnear. And it's kind of like, okay, this guy's just a big old idiot. And then they go to this inn and he rents a room, and then he sees Constance, the beautiful wife of the innkeeper, who is an elderly, like in his late 60s, early 70s at that point in time. She's in maybe her like mid 20s. There's a lot of questioning about whether or not there's some nasty bits happening. How long have they been married? She works for the Queen. She's the dressmaker. She comes home once a week for them to bump uglies. And that's it. And then D'Artagnan is like instantly like, hey, I'm just completely like enthralled with you. And then they end up getting caught up with this whole Duke of Buckingham thing, who's in love with the Queen. And the Queen is played by Geraldine Chaplin, who is just like frustratingly annoying. And not only like these two films, but the Four Musketeers, or the Return of the Musketeers as well, not likable. But the Duke is completely smitten. He's like, I must have you. I love you. And then from there, you get the whole Milady de Winter and the Cardinal bit, and it kind of escalates into a lot of the story that you already know. But I want to go back to this whole D'Artagnan Constance thing, because like she's married and then her husband gets taken by Rochefort to go meet the Cardinal. And then she just sleeps with D'Artagnan and is now apparently his mistress. They're in an affair. She's still married. The husband is still in love with her. The husband still doesn't know anything. And like there's a scene even like towards the end of the movie where Constance and the Queen are talking. And then the camera just flips immediately upside down. It just cuts. It does a 180, flips up on itself. And it cuts back over to the husband, the landlord, and he is like looking at them through this little like spyglass thing with a mirror on it. And at the time, the mirrors aren't even really that great, and it's just like there's so much there that like plays for comedy that shouldn't be there. There's all of these like silly scenes or these extensions or these scenes take forever to get through because they're just like meant to be silly. And it just, I don't know, it just dragged the hell on it. The whole thing, it's like a little, like I said, it's like a little over an hour and a half, but it felt like a lot longer than that because you're just waiting for the story to get going. Every time it picks up, it stops. Every time it picks up, it stops. And that's very frustrating. I will say though, that with the Four Musketeers, that didn't happen as much, or maybe I was just used to it at that point. But it did feel like they really kind of stretched out the first part of that story and then crammed everything into the back end of this. Because, I mean, it made sense for what they were trying to do with it, right? Like the Duke of Buckingham gets these diamonds from the Queen. The Queen's treacherous lady in waiting ends up ratting him out to the Cardinal. The Cardinal then sends Rochefort to send Milady to go after and get the diamonds anyway necessary, get a couple of the studs in order to show the Queen, the King of France, that the Queen is cheating on him. And the whole time, I think even like the King of France, like Louis, pretty much understands that like the Queen just doesn't love him, right? He just like, he pretty much knows that like she is just like a trollop, and he's like, whatever, like, he's mad, but there's nothing he's going to do about it because, I mean, obviously just kind of like the King in the 93 movie, he's very feckless. He's very, that kid was a younger king in the 93 movie, probably more in line with like King Louis from the Return of the Musketeers 20 years down the road, right? That kid. But this was a little bit like that, where he was just as like this kind of like bumbling oaf, very self-centered. But it was really, I think, about like how people viewed the wife, how they viewed their relationship. It was kind of, it was very self-centered. Like it was very superficial is the word I want to use. And I thought that was kind of interesting because it felt like whatever the Cardinal was up to, like never really had any consequences. It never really felt like there was anything of value there. He was scheming and he was doing his stuff, but it always kind of felt, again, like superficial. You're just kind of like, okay, he's just like, what's he trying to do? Is he trying to frame the Queen? Because like when that whole plot falls through, they end up like not really following up on that later on after that part of the story ends. Because where the story ends is they get back the diamonds from Buckingham and, end up giving them to the Queen. She ends up kind of thwarting the Cardinal's plans. And then she makes D'Artagnan a musketeer. And then D'Artagnan and Constance are together, even though Constance is dumb and clumsy and like completely brain dead. Like the ending of the movie even has her getting hit by a dummy as they're walking. Like there's no respect for this character. She's just she's so used by everyone around her. And she doesn't even seem to care. And D'Artagnan, again, doesn't even, like, he seems to care, but only so much. So like, we go into the Four Musketeers and the Cardinal is like, okay, we have to do something about this, right? We have to do something about what the Queen and Buckingham are up to because Buckingham is backing these rebels and these rebels like, are going to go and like, thwart the king and then take over. And then, Buckingham is going to get with the Queen and it's this whole thing, right? And so we start getting into a little bit more political intrigue here because the sequel is called The Revenge of Milady, and it really is kind of Faye Dunaway's show. And Faye Dunaway knocks it out of the park in this one. She is like manipulative. She is evil. She's vile. She doesn't care. Like, she wants her revenge because she felt that D'Artagnan completely just like, snubbed her and everything else. And so, and Constance as well. Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, right? And so they kidnap Constance and they take her over to Rochefort's castle. And then, you've got D'Artagnan and he's like, I don't know where Constance is. But he gets knocked out when she gets kidnapped and he wakes up with Milady and he's like, oh my God, I love you. Even though I'm in love with this woman, I love you. And everyone's like, I don't know, man, stop thinking with your dong and like maybe just like, I don't know, like go find Constance maybe. And he's like, yeah. I'm totally going to go do that. But then he goes right back over to Milady's because he's thinking with his dick. And then he meets Kitty, the maid Kitty. And then they end up having sex. So she's like, we got 10 minutes until Milady comes back and I have needs too. So they go in, they break her bed. And they make a joke about him not finishing. Okay. So then he sneaks out and then sneaks back in to go and confront Milady. And they end up having sex. And then we find out that she's got the fleur-de-lis and she's really, Athos's former wife and all that storyline and everything else. And then she has these like poison acid daggers that she tries throwing at him. Very silly. But I'm watching this and I'm like, he's supposedly in love with Constance. He's supposedly in love with her. And yet he's out there banging the maid, banging Milady. And I can't argue, but both, like Nicole Calfin as Kitty and Faye Dunaway were hot. And then so was Constance. I kind of get it. I'm not going to lie. I kind of understand it. But it just doesn't make him that good of a character. And I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here because there's a point before that when they're talking about Milady. And Athos is like, you should just stay away. All right. Like, just stay away. And he goes like, but I love Constance. I think, and there's other times where he's like, I love Milady with my head. But I love Constance with my heart. But in no way is he faithful. But then, so neither was she. And I'm like, you have these characters that are like you're meant to root for and whatever to like kind of fall in love with each other. That's kind of the point. And they're not good characters. And I don't know if that's in the book or not. I don't feel like it would be. I need to read the book. But I just kind of felt like those scenes really just like took away from the emotional resonance of the story, especially when you get to the end of it, because, the Musketeers, they've got to like go and try to like, get Buckingham and, to get him to what is like not help the rebels or whatever, and then Milady goes back over and she ends up basically like getting arrested for trying to like assassinate the Duke, which is so funny because she goes there, he turns her away, her coach leaves, she jumps out the back of it, she pulls out a single shot revolver, and then it all of a sudden cuts over and there's a Native American tribe there, just randomly, just a bunch of dudes in moccasins and like, leather pants and shit. And then and then Buckingham's like, yeah, well, you're going to go to the tower and then you're going to go and be sent over to America. And then maybe someone there will give you a ride home. Right. But that's what you're going to do. And there's more savages over there. And like, what the hell is going on? Like I said, it came out of freaking ass left field. It was so weird. It was so dang weird. So from there, like she goes up and she meets this tower keeper, right? This guard. And the guard apparently is not going to be able to see beauty. He cannot be seduced. He is a completely, loyal man. She touches him one time and he gets a boner, and then he sees her boobies and he gets a boner. And then like he gets confused because it's boobs and it's a boner. And I get it. And then like they have sex and then she convinces him to assassinate the Duke of Buckingham, which the Duke of Buckingham does die in real life, and he was assassinated. And the way the story is told is that, in this case, Milady de Winter used her femme fatale, feminine wiles, in order to be able to get this guy to go and commit murder. And then she goes back to France, and she's like, yeah, Buckingham's dead. This guy did it. We good. Like, and then she's got this massive hate boner for like the Musketeers, and she just continuously wants them dead. And then she, even before going to kill Buckingham, had worked a deal with the Cardinal about like, give me, basically a warrant to kill these guys. And the Cardinal gives her this like get out of jail free card, which ultimately ends up in the hands of the Musketeers and in D'Artagnan's, pocket, or his boot, really. And so they end up, fighting, they go and they rescue Constance. I'm kind of jumping all over the place here, right? They find out where Constance is, and, D'Artagnan goes to the front lines of this war where the Musketeers just sneak in. Literally, they just walk in to the room. We don't see them enter the castle. We don't see them plan an attack. They just walk into the same room where she is at, and they beat up the guys, and they take her and they go, right? Like, and even during this fight, like the key to the cuffs falls. Constance grabs it. She puts it in her bosom, and Aramis is like, we need the key. And then she starts bouncing up and down so the key will just bonk out. And you're like, right? Like, just, Constance. And even earlier on in the movie, they called her a dumb slut. And I'm just like, yeah, kinda. And I felt like the character was just getting so crapped on. Because after they rescue her, they take her to a nunnery, and they leave her in the convent, and then they go to the front lines, and then they help fight the battle with the rebels by kind of luring them out, so then the French can kill them. They do that. And then they, have to go back to the nunnery to try to get Constance, because Milady de Winter and Rochefort are on their way there to kill her. And in the ensuing battle, D'Artagnan fights and defeats Rochefort, who we think is dead. And then Milady dresses as a nun and uses rosary beads to choke out Constance. And like, that was like that. I felt bad. I legitimately like text H parts, and I was all like, Constance didn't deserve that. She was so dumb. But she was harmless, And so at that point, that's where the movie ends, basically. They end up, sorry. They capture Milady, and then they end up having her executed. They sentence her to death. And then they are arrested by the Cardinal's guards, like right afterward. And then they go talk to the Cardinal. This would be D'Artagnan and the Cardinal. And you're thinking there's going to be this like end battle. They're going to defeat the Cardinal. Well, the Cardinal lived in real life, so they can't kill him. In which case, in the 93 movie, they kill him because you got to, kill the bad guy. But here, the Cardinal was like, well, we're going to sentence all of you to trial and you're all going to die. And then D'Artagnan's like, no, but I got this letter. And then the Cardinal's like, dang it. All right, fine. Here's a lieutenantship in the King's Guard. You earned it. Get the hell out of here. Your friends are free. And then at that point, they become like, he goes and he becomes a lieutenant, and the Musketeers disband. Aramis goes become a priest. Porthos goes off to marry his mistress. And, Athos takes off back to, his manor or whatever it is. And there you go. Like, that's it. Right? Like, there you go. And so the movie kind of has like, and I don't know if the book is the same way, but the movie has this real kind of like lackluster ending. You know what I mean? Like, it feels like, yeah, Milady died. She died for killing Constance, and that's good. That's very good. And then they kind of just like, the Cardinal gets away with it. Rochefort is gone. Like, there's this line the Cardinal says about how much money that D'Artagnan has cost the state for the deaths of Rochefort and for Milady, because they were useful tools to the state. And he's like, I'm not going to pay it, and I don't feel bad. And what are you going to do about it, sort of thing. And I will admit I like that. Because at that point, the Cardinal was like, okay, I'm kind of beat, but like, whatever. I don't really care. Here you go. Just get the hell out of here. Right? Leave me alone, sort of thing. I have cardinaling to do. I've got all this stuff to do. And then it's kind of over, and you're like, I feel like it was anticlimactic. But the movie did pretty well. The budget for both movies was about $4.5 million. And the return for both films was somewhere around $19 million, which is not a bad return for the early 1970s. The movies went on to do well critically. They went on to do well financially. The audiences liked it. And that's a good thing. I just feel like while watching this, maybe because I've got this love for the original. I've got this love for not the original, the 93 movies. And then there's been some other ones since then that I want to see. But the story itself, I wish would have been taken more seriously. Part 2 took itself more seriously, and I found it to be more enjoyable. Part 1 was so over the top in certain ways that I just felt like, come on, you guys are just like, you're trying so hard to make this thing longer that doesn't need to be longer. And so with any luck, I might come back to this down the road and watch it again. And having known all that, because I did like the performances, not so much Michael York. He got better as it went on. Maybe that is the arc of D'Artagnan, to kind of start off as this very clumsy, selfish boy and then grow into a musketeer. And he kind of does, but at the same time, he's not likable. You can like Orthos, Pathos, and Aramis quite well. Oliver Reed does a great job as Athos. Frank Finlay, great job as Porthos. Richard Chamberlain as Aramis, awesome. You can feel that those are seasoned actors and it's in a role that's well defined that they can really kind of play into. Very similar to Kiefer Sutherland, Charlie Sheen, and Oliver Platt. But Chris O'Donnell playing D'Artagnan in the 93 movie, he had naivety, but he had honor. And they talk about honor a little bit in this, especially in the sequel, The Return of the Musketeers. And it's like D'Artagnan doesn't have honor. He hasn't earned honor. When he finds Constance dead, he's upset. But like he never earned that feeling. He never really earned it at all because he was cheating on her. He was like, I don't know if I love her. So he's mad that she's no longer there. And I don't think he cared that she died. I think he cared that it more impacted him. And that's one of the reasons I just do not like that version of D'Artagnan. I like the Chris O'Donnell version because the Chris O'Donnell version had the honor, it had the naivety, but then it had the growth. He had goals, he had desires, and he wasn't going to waver. You've got literally the Musketeers like causing a bar fight in order to steal food and drink. You've got them like robbing guardsmen. It's like, what is this? These are like meant to be like noble men. That's the idea, the presentation, that these are noble servants of the king. But here they're just like petty thugs that have the king's cross on them. And maybe that's the point. I don't know. I just feel like the idea behind it is messy. But the sequel, which I'll talk about, I think kind of redeems itself, to be honest with you. And we'll talk more about that later. Anyway, overall, I did enjoy it. I'm glad to have watched them. I'm glad to have seen them, as I am with every movie. Give them a watch if you want. Let me know your thoughts on it. Recommend me movies to check out. I'll talk to you guys later. Thank you for listening to this episode of Podio Commentary. Have yourself a great day. Be sure to like, subscribe, all that jazz. And peace out.